Good afternoon. I'm very happy to welcome you all here and to welcome Dr. Victor Shih here from Northwestern University. Dr. Shih became an American citizen the old-fashioned way. He emigrated to the United States from Hong Kong and came to the greater Cleveland area. We think of it, Akron, as the greater Cleveland area, and went on to pursue a rather illustrious career in the academy. He's a graduate of George Washington University, where he studied on a university presidential fellowship, and he graduated summa cum laude in East Asian Studies with a minor degree in economics. He received his doctorate from Harvard University, where he researched the banking sector and reform in China. While he was at Harvard, he was a recipient of the Jacob K. Javits Fellowship and a Fulbright Award. Since that time, he has been a professor at Northwestern University, and he has been an advisor to the private sector on banking in China. His first book, Factions in Finance in China, was published with Cambridge University Press, and we're very pleased to welcome him here to Case Western.
Thank you. Well, actually, I've got the hook up here. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, all of you, for having me here. It's a pleasure to be back in this area. In fact, my uncle still lives in this area, so I stayed with him in Medina yesterday. And it was great to catch up with family and to come at a very fortunate and warm time, which I consider myself very lucky. The title of my talk is Awash in Debt. It appeared twice for some reason. I'm sorry about that. State liabilities and the future of the Chinese economy. When I talk about debt, I don't mean debt that America owes to China, which there is a large part. But I will be talking about debt that the Chinese government owes to the Chinese people. So when we think of China these days, at least if you look at the popular media, people tend to think of how rich and resourceful China is because it has $3 trillion in its foreign exchange reserve. Of course, over $1 trillion of that foreign exchange reserve is U.S. Treasury debt. And this is what people are talking about when people say that, oh, the U.S. owes China a tremendous amount of money. There's, of course, a lot of problems with that interpretation, and I'm sure some people in the audience here can elucidate that. We also think about all the companies, oil companies, energy companies that China is aggressively trying to acquire, both in the U.S. but also in Africa and Latin American countries. But I think when we think about the Chinese economy, the one problem we have is that the Chinese government is very eager to show you, if you think of China as kind of like a company, and I'll get into there's actually good reasons to think of China as a company, China is showing you all the assets that it has, right? So it has a huge foreign exchange reserve, and they're very good at hiding their liabilities, right? So in any kind of company or any kind of household, right? So in your own house, you own a house. It's like, if you own $1 million mansion, all you tell people is that, look, I own $1 million mansion, and you neglect to tell people that, in fact, you have borrowed $900,000 or $1 million to buy this $1 million mansion, right? And a lot of people in the U.S. have done that, unfortunately. So in fact, this is what China is doing, though. So China projects the asset side. You get to see it very clearly, $3 trillion foreign exchange reserve, lots of large corporations. But it actually, if you consider what we call contingent liabilities, the Chinese government owes a lot of money. So it's not just the government. The Chinese government has a lot of state-owned enterprises, a lot of companies, holding companies, corporations, industrial corporations, which are in reality owned by the Chinese state. And if they go bankrupt or if they default on a loan, ultimately it is the obligation of the central government to bail out these entities. And that's what I mean by contingent liabilities, right? So contingent liability means if everything goes well, you don't owe anything. But if something goes wrong, then you become the person who has to pay back everything. And in that score, China actually has a huge amount of debt. And I'm going to try to dissect that a little bit today and think about the implications of the Chinese government having such a huge pool of debt. Okay. So, again, we begin by looking broadly at all the liabilities in the formal financial system. There's also an underground banking system, which we won't talk about because we know there are other experts in that on that score. We examine who's ultimately on the hook for this enormous pool of liabilities, and it's a central government of the People's Republic of China, and who the creditors are. The creditors basically are the people of China, and I'll get into it. Even though sort of officially it's the state banks, the banks lend to these state-owned corporations, but the deposit in the state banks, of course, come from households primarily. And then we infer some policy and welfare implications. Okay, so this is a horrible balance sheet which you can basically ignore most of it. But if you look at this column, right? So a lot of the loans, these are loans in the banking system, and the unit which got cut off at the top here, these are trillions of renminbi. So trillion, not billions, trillions, right? And the exchange rate right now is like 6.6 to 1. So a trillion renminbi is still like well over $100 billion, right? There are these local investment companies in China. And so there's a big difference between how highways and airports and roads are built in China and how they're financed in the U.S. In the U.S., typically a city or the state will issue bonds if they don't have enough money. Either they use budgetary allocation or they issue a bond, and it's explicitly the government that's issuing the bonds, and the government will use tax receipts to repay the bonds, right? In China, again, they want to hide the fact that they're borrowing money, so they don't issue bonds themselves. What they do is they set up these local investment companies, which are companies, but the companies are wholly owned actually by the Chinese government. They then go to the banks and borrow huge amounts of money. And I was the first one to estimate that it's actually the amount outstanding of this loan is roughly 11 trillion renminbi, which is well over $1 trillion. It's actually like $1.7 trillion, right? So trillion, again, with a T, not with a B. Huge amount of money. There are central state enterprises, and I'm thinking about like Ball Steel, Sinopec, PetroChina, some of the companies that you're familiar with. They actually borrow a huge amount of money from the banking sector. That amount is 10 trillion renminbi, so again, over $1 trillion. There are a lot of local industrial SOEs, state-owned enterprises, which also borrow a lot of money. And finally, there's some private borrowing, which is, of course, not the obligation of the state. So this column shows you who's ultimately owing this money. And when it's household debt, of course, the household ultimately has to pay. When it's private sector pays. But in three large categories, it's the government that ultimately has to pay if there's a default. In the bond market is completely dominated by the government. The only non-government, and actually all the bond issuers are government related. I don't count central bank bills because it's mainly a monetary instrument, and we can get into a discussion of that if anyone's interested. But there's treasuries, which is treasuries. There are policy banks in China which issue bonds. And this kind of bond is actually explicitly guaranteed by the central government. So it is explicit government liability. Commercial banks, which are state-owned, they issue a lot of bonds. And then the state-owned enterprises issue bonds. There's illiquid bond, which I won't get into, but they're basically to recapitalize all the banks. Because the banks were insolvent back in 2000. To recapitalize the banks, the Chinese government set up these special purpose vehicles to inject bad assets into, and then those vehicles actually issued bonds to the banks which received the bailouts. So it's kind of like round tripping, left hand giving to right hand, more or less a big Ponzi scheme. And this also I won't talk about. This is very highly technical. But basically, a lot of these state-owned enterprises owe each other money, and it's long-term debt that's not being paid back by anybody. And this pool of money that state-owned enterprises owe to each other is just building up year after year. And again, the amount now is really huge. Is at least 12 trillion renminbi, so at least almost $2 trillion, right? So when you add all of this together, the amount of debt in the financial system that's ultimately is the debt of the central government totals $9.6 trillion. So again, it's trillion dollars. That's 1.9 times China's GDP in 2009. It's 95% of its money supply. The scary thing is that this amount is 10 times total government tax revenue in 2009. Right? So it's a huge amount of debt. So when we worry about debt in the U.S., actually, what is our debt to GDP ratio now? It's like 70%, right? Like 80%, 70, 80%. China arguably is actually worse, much, much worse. It's twice. Since the central government has to pay it back ultimately, it's actually, this debt is 20 times central government revenue. And so in China, there's this weird way where revenue gets broken down to central and local revenue. So it's huge. Basically, it's liabilities. But in the short term, there's not going to be a financial crisis in China. So I'm sure some of you have heard or seen on Bloomberg that there are some hedge fund managers, like this guy named Chanos, who's saying that the Chinese economy is going to collapse very soon because of this huge amount of debt. I would say that that's not true because all the banks in China are owned by the government. And so in the U.S., what happened was all the banks panicked and withdrew lines of credit from everybody else, from each other. And that partly, at least that was the immediate cause of this big financial crisis. In China, because all the banks are owned by the state, the Communist Party, which controls the entire state, will order all the banks to continue to provide financing to all the debtors that I'm talking about here. So a lot of loans, actually non-performing loans, get rolled over. So it becomes a liquid. The bank just issue a new loan to the borrower, and the borrower use part of the new loan to repay the old loan. So all the debt gets rolled over, everything keeps going, right? So in the short term, there's no massive withdrawal of liquidity. But as I'll talk about, this is not free. So there's no free lunch in economics. Somebody always pays. And it's the households that pay in this kind of scenario. Okay, so the implication is that one sort of short-term implication is that, so China right now is running 5% inflation, officially 5%, but then they fudge the statistics. So in reality, inflation rates in China is around 7% or 8% even. But the Chinese government has only raised interest rates by 75 basis points. So less than 1%, so 0.75%. This is, obviously, the Chinese government is totally not using interest rates as an instrument to fight inflation. And I would argue is that the reason is very simple. After what I've told you, the simple reason is that, well, when you're the biggest debtor in the entire financial system by a long margin, why would you raise interest rates on yourself? And of course, the other precondition being that the central bank is totally not independent. I mean, it's totally dependent on the Chinese Communist Party. All the top officials are appointed by CCP, Politburo, and so on and so forth. So raising interest rates becomes very costly. Every basis point increase in rates imposes an additional 4.8 billion renminbi in additional annual interest. So recently, they raised interest rates by 25 basis points. And that actually, when you have that much debt, that in itself raises your annual interest payment by 120 billion renminbi, which is almost, let me think, $20 billion, which is not a lot, but it's just 25 basis points. 1/4% already raises financing costs substantially. So thus, rate hike is highly undesirable against inflation. So what do they do instead? They first of all, they tell everyone that, oh, well, 5% inflation is normal. We'll just accept it. The other thing that they do is price control. So once you impose the Soviet style, right? Like once you impose price control on, say, rice or wheat or cotton, then that becomes the only price that you have to report in your statistical release, because that's the official price, right? There's no one's supposed to deviate from that. Of course, there's all kinds of black market now in China and all kinds of problems with price control. So that's the immediate implication. The other implication, I think, is that is a classic kind of soft budget constraint story, which is that when the state controls the financial system so absolutely, and the financial system is used to bail out state-owned enterprises on such a large scale, the state-owned enterprises become just very addicted to this huge amount of liquidity. And so what you have to do is that every year there has to be new liquidity in the system to keep everything running. Otherwise, the whole house of cards collapse. And so money supply actually in the past 15, 20 years in China has grown on average 17% a year, right? So that's a really high speed of money supply growth. China, M2 as a share of GDP is higher in China than in pretty much all developing countries. And most developed countries, I would add, with the exception of like kind of Hong Kong and Switzerland, which are financial centers. So you know, money supply as a GDP is like twice, 1.8 times, something like that. So to avoid non-performing loans from appearing on a large scale and a sudden slowdown in credit expansion, the People's Bank of China, which is a central bank in China, allows money supply to increase very robustly every year, year after year. And this is something that they have to do. And so there's a lot of talk like, oh, well, China runs, as many of you know, runs a big trade surplus. So there's a huge amount of foreign exchange influx into China every year. And so there's a talk like, well, as a result, the central bank must aggressively sterilize the FX inflows. Sterilization is this operation where, so if a lot of money is coming into your country because you run a trade surplus, that creates inflation, right? Because there's more money supply. And this only applies when there's capital control and fixed exchange rates. So whatever, you don't have to worry about that part. To counteract that, what the central bank can do is to issue a bond. So when you issue a bond, you actually soak up some of this liquidity, so this liquidity gets locked up, right? So this is what the Chinese government does. And so people say that, well, that's what the Central Bank of China has done very aggressively. But I will show you that, in fact, that's not what they have done. So I'll show you this really awesome chart that I made. So this blue line here is central bank bills outstanding as a share of the entire foreign exchange reserve. If the Chinese government was aggressively issuing bills to counteract inflows, you would see this line either increasing or more or less flat at a certain level. But instead, so in this period, China has had massive, massive trade surplus, massive, massive inflows. But the bills outstanding as a share of foreign exchange reserve actually declined substantially from 40% in this 2006 to less than 20% today. So clearly, and I would argue the reason is because the Chinese economy is so addicted to new liquidity that over time they've had to counteract less and less of this FX inflows, less and less of this massive increase in money supply because the entire banking sector is so addicted to new liquidity, right? And you see this, and another sign of this is that this is a ratio of medium to long-term loans in the banking system. You see the illiquidity of a lot of these loans. So a lot of these loans were short-term corporate loans. When the borrower can't pay the loan back, they get switched into long-term loans. And so you've also at the same time seen over time a very substantial rise in the share of medium to long-term loans in the banking system. The banking system accounts for a huge part of money supply. So banks is really the only game in town in China. So China is a bank-based system. And if you pull this actually scale back a couple years previously, so in 2004, the share of medium to long-term loans was only 40%, and by now it's over 60% of all loans outstanding. So I would argue, and I've argued in many places, that this is a sign of the illiquidity that's facing the financial system, which is why you require this huge amount of increase in money supply every year from FX inflows to make the entire system liquid, right? Right. So So this also suggests that the government is reluctant to use stringent credit control to aggressive sterilization to fight inflation. They really can't fight inflation that aggressively using monetary means, because if they did, it would cost massive amount of non-performing loans in the entire system. All of these illiquid loans would all of a sudden show up on the balance sheets, and it would look extremely bad for China. People would lose confidence in the Chinese government, and that's the last thing they want to see happen. But the interesting thing is that going forward, kind of inflation pressure will just increase, because for a long time, China has benefited from basically an increase in the labor pool consistently. For the past 20 years, the labor pool of working age labor aged between 16, which is really the starting working age in China, 16 and 55 has just grown and grown and grown. But going forward, it's actually going to begin to shrink year after year. So it provides a floor on inflation rates. So one implication of that is that we're just going to see higher average level of inflation than we've seen in the past 5 years, especially given that the Chinese government will not use monetary tools to fight inflation, because they can't. Because if they fought it too hard, there'd be a huge amount of non-performing loans in the banking system, right? Okay, and you can see, so then you ask, well, but what did they do before? So China didn't always have such a huge amount of FX inflows, foreign exchange inflows into the economy. But at the same time, money supply grew and grew and grew in the past. Also, what they did before was just to print money, that fell a little bit because they didn't need to print money anymore. And this is just PBOC lending to financial institutions, which AKA also known as printing money, which is actually what the Federal Reserve did recently on a fairly large scale. Although I would say that compared to China, as a share of GDP, is still very small. So we're doing well. Recently, this actually peaked up a little bit. It remains to be seen whether this is going to be a trend. I actually think this, even if not this year, 2 years from now, they will need to start printing money on a pretty large scale to keep the entire system liquid going forward. So then you ask, well, okay, so what? So a lot of these very optimists on China, they tell me, in case you don't know, I'm kind of pessimistic about the future of the Chinese economy, just a little bit. And so the bulls, in Wall Street, there are a lot of people very bullish about China. They tell me, well, so what? Chinese government controls the banks. There's capital control. So what? There's a little bit of higher inflation. No big deal, right? I would say it is a big deal because in the banking system, the net savers, the net depositors, right? So roughly speaking, there are three big sectors in the banking system. There's government, corporations, and households. Households put a huge amount of money into the banking system, but they're only able to borrow a little bit from the banking system. Corporations put a little bit of money as deposits in the banking system, but they're able to borrow a huge amount from the banking system, right? And this is the net amount of deposits that household put in the banking system. It grew from 5 trillion renminbi, which is in today's exchange rate, $0.8 trillion. It grew from that to, over almost 20 trillion renminbi last year in 2010. So this is the amount that households put in the banks minus the amount that households are borrowing from the banks. And basically, besides reserve requirements, much of that is then lent to the corporate sector. And so households putting huge amount of money, and the interest rates that household gets when they put money in the bank, in state-owned banks, is extremely low. And in fact, is way below inflation rate. So right now, official inflation rate is 5%. Household on average gets 1.7% in interest. So they're losing 3.3% every year. And when you talk about 3.3% of 20 trillion renminbi, it's a huge tax on the household year after year. So the savings actually gets eroded. So that's what I mean. In economics, somebody always pays. There's no free lunch. And basically, in this case, the households, so it's almost the, well, not the reverse exactly, but it's similar to what's happening in this country. Well, at the end of the day, it's always the household that pay. Who else is going to pay? So households pay with this implicit inflation tax that the government has deliberately imposed on the household sector. So then again, the Wall Street types say, well, so what? The so what about this is that in the future, the Chinese economy must rely on domestic consumption as an engine of growth because export is going to slow down. I mean, there's still a huge amount of export from China. There's still outsourcing. But the pace is going to slow down because labor costs in China is rising very rapidly. Actually, it's rising by 20% every year for low-skilled laborers. And at the same time, the other source of growth would be investment, but investment is debt-driven. So this is why all these state-owned enterprises borrow so much money, is they use it to invest, but it's debt-driven, so that's not sustainable. The only other source of growth is domestic consumption, but that's really hard when you're taking people's money away on such a massive scale. Not just this, there's also land confiscation, which is another tax on the household sector. So this is just another way of looking at the same issue. This is the household deposit minus loans to households over time. It's decreased a little bit over time. So net trend as a share of GDP. Oops, sorry, as a share of GDP, right? So it was like 55% of GDP. So year after year, if you can imagine, the equivalent of 50% of a country's economy is transferred from the household level to the corporate sector. It's really mind-boggling. And I'll show you that the U.S. is completely the opposite, actually. It's declined a little bit to 47% or so. The reason is because mortgages. But I would argue that actually mortgages is yet, so the rise of speculative real estate bubble, which is going very strong in China, is yet another way that depletes household disposable income and household consumption. Because if you're throwing all your money into buying just one flat for yourself, you don't have any money left over to spend on other things. Right? So that's also really bad for the Chinese economy, and I'm happy to answer questions about that. This is loans to household as a share of GDP. Again, it rose a little bit at the end because of mortgages, but it's basically stayed around 20%, right? This is the U.S. So the U.S. was very low, back in the 50s. This is household debt, which mainly is bank loans, of course, as a share of GDP. But I would say that there was a pretty healthy period where, household borrowing is around 40 to 60% of GDP. And of course, later on, it became really crazy. It became like 100% of GDP, which is why we had our financial crisis. But so look at this picture, right, where it's really high, households borrowing as a share of GDP, comparing to this, right? This is China. It's a totally different world, right? And this is why consumption lags behind growth rates year after year, because households can't get financing for anything except for mortgages. It's really hard to get consumer loans in China, so that's why consumption lags behind, and this is part of the reason why there's a huge global imbalance, is Chinese consumers can't consume very much. And of course, the U.S. is the other side of the equation, and the U.S. just went too crazy with the spending, and this is why there's a big problem. So. So just to recap, debt dominates the financial system, is mainly used to finance government entities. So the owners of most of the borrowers in the financial system is the Chinese government. Because government entities are also main creditors, the risk of a financial crisis is minimal. So the central bank just orders everyone to not withdraw lines of credit from anybody, right? So in the short term is kind of okay. But because the government is the main debtor, it doesn't want to raise interest rates. It doesn't want to restrict money supply creation. So there's just going to be 5 or 6% inflation in China going forward for the next few years. I really don't see how China can avoid that, short of another global crisis which sees dramatic slowdown in the world's economic growth. That could actually introduce some deflationary pressure in China. But otherwise, if the US and Europe begins to grow pretty fast again, actually inflation pressure will be extremely bad in China because they already have this floor, inflationary floor caused by the shrinking labor supply in China. So depositors face negative returns on the deposits. And I calculate that the annual tax for depositors, household depositors, is almost 1 trillion renminbi. So it's like 140, 150 billion dollars. It's a huge tax for developing countries. If you think about in China, GDP per capita is like how much is it? Like $5,000, I think these days, $5,000. So a huge tax on households. So this makes transition to a consumption-based growth model very difficult. Persistent high inflation in China means more expensive goods in the U.S. That's, so it's not going to be so cheap to go to Walmart to buy some Chinese-made goods. But in a way, that's good, reduces U.S. trade deficit vis-a-vis China at least. But so a lot of, some of the low-cost manufacturers are now moving to Vietnam, Cambodia, India to a certain extent. Some of them still like China because the infrastructure is really great, so they like China. But anyone who offshores in China today, they have to take into consideration that labor costs will grow by 15-20% every year from this point onward. Definitely at least in the next 5 years. Household depositors are under great pressure to earn a positive return. This is why they tend to throw their money into real estate because they don't have anything else to throw toward to protect themselves from inflation. And at some point, I was telling, there could be capital flight if there's higher relative returns offshore. So these are my cheery kind of notes here, and I welcome any suggestions or questions. Yeah, sure.
So can you go back to your first slide? I really enjoyed. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this.
Mm-hmm.
But if you wouldn't mind going back to I just have a question about the sources of growth, because the only answer is, of course, you can outgrow your
debt,
all your problems, and you would ordinarily think this is impossible with a situation like this, but this is China with its growth rates. So where are those three government under loans to non-financial corporations? So the government is they have to pay in the last resort. So where's the growth coming from in China? Is it coming from the private sector there, or is it also the government?
No, so all of these entities are engaging in very intensive investment drives. And it's investment that's generating a lot of the growth. So it's like on the margin, I think it's something like 60% of the growth comes from investment. But it's very inefficient. So you would have like year after year, 30% increase in investment just to generate 10% growth.
Got
I mean,
it.
sure, 10% growth is great, but then you have to have 30% investment to generate that much growth. And the reason why these entities are able to do that is because they're free money. They just take money. There's a huge amount of liquidity. So that's why when you go to China, people get very impressed. It's like, wow, brand new airports, brand new everything, like highways, brand new buildings, brand new everything. That is great, but you think about it, it's also a waste of money. Like the private sector would never do that because the private sector would have hard budget constraints. Well, I don't know, never, but like not on such a large scale. I mean, sure, there'll be cases where there's huge amount of investment caused by some, misinformation in the market or soft budget constraints sometimes. But in China, it's the entire country. So if you're part of the state apparatus, if you're a state-owned enterprise, you go to the bank and say, look, just make up, and literally I've talked to these people, they just make up something. They're in the middle of nowhere in a desert and be like, we're going to do a genetic engineering science park here. Give us a loan. And then it's in the middle of a desert, then you're like, why? what? He's like, no problem. We'll definitely have, we got money set aside to attract the best, brightest minds from America to come work in these labs. We're in talks with they're always in talks with various investors to get these investment here. And the banks will assume that they're telling the truth and give them the money. So there's a huge amount of money to build. There are at least 30,000 science and industrial parks in China, all over China. And sure, maybe a few hundred of them will be successful, but trillions of dollars went into building all the other, 29,000 of them, and it's dead, right? So there has to be cash flow to repay these loans, but there isn't, right? So a lot of these loans get rolled over, and that's the story of China, more or less. Oh yeah, sure, yeah, sorry.
You mentioned that Jim Chanos has been a China bear for years on
Sure.
CNBC, et cetera. But I think one of his main tenets is that he says that the numbers, the financial numbers for the country, are bogus. So the question for you is, your numbers. How much uncertainty do you have in the numbers?
So some people actually attack me for being too bearish, because we don't know, right? So the Chinese government reports just a big blob that says loans to non-financial corporations. I am pretty sure about the local investment platforms because I've done some, accounting of that, very fine-tuned accounting, which I'm happy to get into. But these two parts, loans to central SOEs and loans to local industrial SOEs, basically guesses based on everything else that I know. So some people say, well, that's too high. A lot of this borrowing really is done by the private sector. But in the official statistics of China, a company would be considered a private corporation if it's only minority owned by the state. But what happens in many cases I've seen, these so-called private companies would be 40% owned by the Ministry of Finance, which is the state, but 30% owned by China Life, which is an insurance company which is wholly owned by the state. But because it itself is not the state, it's a corporation, then in official Chinese statistics, they're like, well, this is a private company because it's 60% owned by non-state entities. But the reality is that it's state-owned because the other shareholders are state-owned, so that makes this entity state-owned. There are thousands and thousands. So these central SOEs, there are only 105 of them. Guess how many subsidiaries there are that the government could find so far? So 105 companies, how many subsidiaries can there be? Take a wild guess. 105.
10,000.
Higher.
100,000.
Lower. That's a good one, though. It's 60,000. 60,000 that they can find. 60,000 subsidiaries, 15,000 of them overseas. So I don't know where these companies, actually mostly in Hong Kong. There are a huge number of overseas subsidiaries in Hong Kong engaged in all kinds of nefarious and profitable or money-losing schemes. They don't care for state-owned enterprises. They don't care if they make money or lose money. For them, the game is to always invent the next story so they can get more money from the bank. Because the banks will heavily lend them money. All they have to come up with is a story. Like, yeah, we're going to do this great thing, in Hong Kong and Zimbabwe. We're going to buy some mines. And then the China Development Bank gives them a huge pot of money, and then who knows what happens to the money, yeah.
So the implication, then, is that these numbers are conservative. That the problem is probably worse. I mean, if you say that the loan of the companies that apply for loans are exaggerating, and that the banks are readily accepting the exaggeration, that the implication is that.
The banking statistics. Yeah, the banking statistics fairly accurate. At least the overall number is very accurate. The bond statistics also very accurate. One thing that's missing in my analysis is that a lot of these state-owned enterprises and local state-owned enterprises, they have overseas subsidiaries that are borrowing from overseas banks. We don't know how much there is. So it's a huge amount. Probably, I wouldn't say it's over $1 trillion, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's $200-300 billion. And that, there's just no data on that. I don't know. But they have, for sure, the tens of thousands of overseas subsidiaries of these state-owned enterprises and their sub-subsidiaries and so on and so forth, they've borrowed hundreds of billions of dollars from foreign banks or Chinese banks with overseas branches. Oh, yeah.
Listening to your discussion on money and banking in China, I was thinking about the upcoming G20 talks. Sarkozy is hosting it this year, and they've already put out a draft statement talking they want to deal with sovereign debt, the crisis in the Eurozone, currency policy. But they also talked about hoping to get the U.S., China, and others to sit down to talk about amending the international monetary system. And I've heard that there's some concern that China won't be too cooperative. I don't know why, but based upon the internal situation in China, would it be hard to work a deal at the G20 based upon that? It looks like in Europe there's sovereign debt crises, but it's a different sort of sovereign debt crisis in China. Is that correct? And while Europe is facing potentially a deflationary depression, China is just the opposite.
Yeah, because the wave that they will solve this problem is through inflation. So in a way, you can criticize the Germans. They're too afraid of inflation, right? Because you can always try to have some inflation and inflate away part of that debt, and then but the Germans are very draconian. I don't know anything about Europe, but in terms of China, I would say about the Chinese government is that. So I tell this to the Chinese government. I have friends in the central bank. And they're like, yeah. There's, actually some of them are very bearish. They're like, yeah, Victor, you're totally right. It's not pretty out there. And like we're fighting fires every day. Like, in fact, there are many banks that go under in China every day. Except when that happens, the central bank flies a team over. I mean, it's kind of like the FDIC, except they don't tell anybody about it. Flies a team over there, take over the bank, and massively inject liquidity. They don't tell anybody. They just do it, right? So this happens on a large scale. So those people are very bearish. But the other central bankers are like, yeah. But what's going to happen? All the banks are state-owned. We tell them not to panic, and they don't panic because they know we can always print some money and give it to them. So everyone's fine. And at the same time, we try to hide these problems from the foreigners. And we just show the foreigners the $3 trillion that we have in the foreign exchange reserve and try to muscle our way, in these international bodies. And I think what China is fighting for is more vote shares in IMF relative to how much money they put in. So they're trying to maximize the influence they have, which, given how much the U.S. certainly isn't so willing to put in money to help Europe and how much the Germans are not so willing to. I mean, I leave that to the experts to help Europe. They're taking China's money. The other funny thing I heard from the Chinese, so for a while, these central bankers are trying to diversify the portfolio of the Chinese foreign exchange reserve to buy more non-dollar denominated assets. So they were buying euro stuff pretty aggressively, and then they're like, dang, what happened there? Actually, they were even more pissed off the second time it happened. So there was first round of European panic. Last year, when the second round hit, they're like, man, we thought it was over. We went over there, we gave him some money, we thought it was over. Now we have to give him some more money, But then I'm like, well, but you're used to throwing good money after bad money because that's what you do in your country, And they're like, yeah, I guess it's true.
I wonder if I could just ask a follow-up question. This idea of a state-owned bank, here in the United States, there's only one state-owned bank. It's in the state of North Dakota. It started in 1919 when the farmers got together, when the East Coast banks and the railroads and the granaries were doing things to drive them out of business and seize their land. So all the revenues in the state of North Dakota are deposited in this bank, and they use fractional reserve banking, which I presume is what they do in China, and they leverage it out 10 to 1 or whatever. And right now, with the financial crisis going on in the United States, there's a half a dozen states where legislation has been introduced to create a state-owned bank. And in North Dakota, they create it, they leverage the money, and they give loans to businesses, low-interest loans to students and others. And in the last 10 years, this state-owned bank in the United States has returned $1/3 of $1 billion to the state. That's the interest payments that go back to the state. They don't go to private investors. So I'm wondering why in China, maybe China ought to study what they do in North Dakota to see how to make a state-owned bank work.
Well, it's one thing having one bank that's state-owned and a very small scale. It's really quite unimaginable. Like for me, it's a natural state of thing because I've been studying this for over 10 years. So it's like, yeah, all the banks are owned by the state. It's hard for. I sometimes talk to these bankers who used to work in New York and they just moved to the Beijing office of Goldman Sachs, whatever. They're shocked. I mean, shell-shocked. It just works completely differently. There's no market. The state dictates everything. So the interest rate is controlled by the state, right? Especially deposit interest rates. So banks can't compete to offer depositors higher interest rates. It's all set by the central bank. And so you just run up to this interest rate ceilings. The other thing is that when interest rate is set artificially low, which is the case. So the good thing about the U.S. is that interest rate is set so the interest rate is always affected by the Federal Reserve. But besides that, there is some market competition in terms of interest rates. So I don't know enough about economics to say, but there must be some market competition for interest rates. So banks can compete in terms of offering depositors higher interest rates and then also charging borrowers different kinds of interest rates. In China, this is all regulated, and the entire financial system artificially offers borrower very low interest rates, right? Especially relative to when you have inflation rates of 5%. So there's a huge demand for credit in China, and the state, it's called, credit rationing, rations the credit to state-owned borrowers or borrowers who have some ties with the political elite. So banking, not only is it highly inefficient because only state actors get access to loans, it also becomes very corrupt. So if you have connections with the political elite, then you're able to borrow money. If not, you're not, right? You can say, wow, yeah, this happens in the U.S. I mean, that, to a certain extent, that's certainly true. But it's unimaginable for the entire system to operate this way. So this is giant rent-seeking, giant sort of inefficient allocation of capital, and it's something that I don't think you want to copy at all. I mean, whether China can copy a state-owned bank model in the U.S., the first thing they have to do is liberalize interest rates, which they're not willing to do. The second thing they have to do is to allow a lot of these large SOEs to go bankrupt. But it's hard because the central SOEs, the CEOs for these companies, are in the central committee. The same thing in the Soviet Union, I'm sure some of the large SOEs. So, it's like you're not going to allow the company of a congressman or a senator to go bankrupt. It's very hard to imagine. Well, I mean, in the U.S., I don't know, but Cheney, yeah, Kelly.
So if people are losing money on their savings that they put in banks, why do they bother doing it, especially if there's a credit shortage? Why not use the money to start their own little companies on the side, or to buy luxuries, or, to pay for
housing,
tutors for their
estate,
children?
yeah.
I mean, you said they're spending it on real estate, but, why are they putting as much as they are in banks, and aren't there other things to spend on?
Yeah, so this goes to the question of why is savings rate so high in China generally. There's no Social Security in China. There's no pension. So people save because they have to. I mean, so the answer is because they have to. There's no, the mutual funds, so some people put some money in the mutual fund, but the stock market is relatively small, and it's because total insider trading in the stock market. There's no, and then the return has been very, very volatile, and actually Chinese stock market performed, this is a little known fact outside the China circle, the U.S. stock market actually had a decent return last year. I forgot, it was like 12% increase, New York stock exchange. The Chinese stock market actually decreased last year. It's because everyone knows it's a total insider game. This is why we outlaw insider trading. And all you have to understand why, is just look at China. China is completely insider trading. After a while, people just don't want to put their money in the stock market because they know it's totally rigged and it's poor return. In the bank, you're losing a little bit every year, but you know you're not going to lose everything. So this is why people put money in the bank. And when they see a real estate opportunity, they'll plow money into real estate, which up to this point has grown pretty consistently over time. But now, because of high inflation, people are doing desperate things like hoarding rice, hoarding, various kinds of commodities. Huge surge in gold buying, so really, really high demand to buy actual bullion. So people just buy gold, put it in their house. So yeah, people are because the state controls the financial system. There's no futures market. You can't hedge against your stock investments. There's no options, nothing like that. People are very much afraid to really put their savings in the stock market. So the bank is still the best option. Yeah, Katie?
Yeah, and I was just going to ask, what do you think are the U.S. dollar exchange rate implications for all of this? Because while you were talking, I was thinking it could go a couple of different ways, and I would assume this is part of the reason why the Chinese are so reluctant to devalue the renminbi.
So, according to Timothy Geithner, your favorite person, in his remarks a week and a half ago at Johns Hopkins University, when I heard that, I just laughed because what he said was, well, the Chinese have revalued a lot in real terms because their inflation rate is higher than ours. That's true. But I'm like, well, good luck selling that to the American public. I mean, who knows, real revaluation? But that's the kind of, that's why Treasury ultimately did not label China as a currency manipulator, because in reality, actually, they've done pretty well in terms of real, revaluation. Nominally, they revalued by almost 3% last year, plus there was 5% inflation. That's a lot, This year they're not going to do 3% nominal, maybe 2% nominal, but there'll be for sure 5-6% inflation. So once again, you get another 8% in real revaluation. Pretty good, but of course, American voters are not going to buy it. But I think soon the offshoring will slow dramatically because China is too expensive. At least offshoring to China will slow dramatically. But the problem with India, which is the other country with large labor pool, is that their infrastructure is lags too far behind. So for a while, actually, I think there would be a decent situation for U.S. workers, where you hear a couple cases of industries actually coming back to the U.S. because shipping costs is too high. Yeah, so there could be more in the future. Especially not back to the U.S., but to Mexico. Definitely. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I know. I've seen some, either newspaper,
seen in a newspaper or TV within the last year that some of the cheap stuff that is large and bulky that was made in China is now being brought back and made in the USA because if you take in the transportation costs, it's cheaper to do it here.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's way too soon to say there's going to be a huge trend in doing that, and I'm not convinced that it would come back to the U.S. Much of it will just go to Southeast Asia, some India, and then Mexico. But maybe a little bit will come back to the U.S. Because labor costs will rise very aggressively in China. Yeah.
You've mentioned Hong Kong a number of times, and I'm just wondering, what is the relationship of the capital markets in Hong Kong to the government in China?
So Hong Kong is the international window for all these state-owned enterprises. So what they do is that a lot of these SOEs will take all their good assets and put it all in one subsidiary and list that subsidiary in Hong Kong. So you see this is PetroChina, and actually all the big Chinese state-owned enterprises that list in Hong Kong, and some of them even in the U.S., like China Aluminum, China Telecom, PetroChina, Sinopec, the listed entity is only actually in many cases a small part of the entire corporation. Much of the corporations back in mainland China borrowing huge amounts of money from the banks, but they take the good-looking assets at least. Some of them are not even actually good assets. They just look good with some decent cash flows or whatever, package them together, show it to international investors in Hong Kong, and they're able to raise money through issuing shares and issuing bonds. So this year, the big story will be, because the central government is trying to fight inflation a little bit through monetary means, so that there's a credit quota now that's imposed on Chinese banks. So instead of increasing new credit by 20%, they can only increase it by 15%. That's harsh monetary policy in China. When money supply is increasing 15% a year. So some of these SOEs are already kind of cash strapped. So they go to Hong Kong and they issue bonds. But the problem is they have to pay higher interest rates. So offshore rates much higher, actually, because, and this is where you can see that investors are not stupid either, right? So offshore investors, when they are thinking about buying bonds issued by some of these state-owned enterprises or developers from China, they demand, 8% interest, 10%, sometimes even 15%, because they know that in fact there is a lot of risk in the whole system. So Hong Kong is a window. It's really helped these Chinese companies to raise huge amounts of money. Part of the recapitalization of the state banks was done through issuing shares in Hong Kong. But it's minority ownership, right? So it's only 20% of the shares are traded publicly. The rest is still owned by the government. So I would argue that the suckers who got suckered into buying those Chinese bank shares really didn't know what they were getting themselves into. They're buying minority shares of state banks. Granted, so people back then argued that, actually it's a great thing that the Chinese government control interest rates because the banks are guaranteed a margin, right? So if the government controls deposit interest rates, controls lending interest rate, there's always this gap between deposit and lending that banks can benefit from. And it's like they're getting free money, except what the government giveth, it can also take away. And right now, because of inflation, the government is saying, oh crap, we don't want to run on the banks. So we're raising deposit interest rates without really raising lending interest rates. So the banks are getting squeezed. And so now all these investors are like, oh geez, I guess I should have thought of that actually before. So profit margins declining, and now no one wants to buy Chinese bank shares. But it was a hot item for a long. Goldman Sachs was like, hey, why not buy shares where there's free money? That's always a great thing, right? Yeah.
I hear a lot about the potential massive real estate bubble because it's one of the few decent places to invest. And at first I was wondering what would be like the immediate consequences if you think like something like that would actually burst. But then I was wondering, if there is such a constant influx and growth in the money supply in the short term, is there any chance that it even would burst if that money is constantly being created?
In the short term, there isn't much of a risk. And in fact, Chinese corporations and also households are throwing the money into real estate speculation like you never believe it. And now they're going after smaller cities. So the past few years, we go after Beijing, Shanghai. And so now you buy a flat for the price of a 150 square meter flat in Beijing, you can buy a beach house in California, $2 million. So it's crazy in Beijing already. And anyone been to Beijing? Actually, who's been to Beijing recently? Does it have clean air? Is there nice sunshine? Where's the beach in Beijing? Can someone show me the beach in Beijing? Not too much traffic. Yeah, right, no traffic. They do, okay, one thing about Beijing is, some of my friends tell me, is it has 70 golf courses around Beijing. The problem with that is that northern China is running out of water. And Beijing is, pouring water on the 70 golf courses around Beijing. So anyway, that's a separate issue. So the property bubble. So there's still a lot of room for the second and third tier cities' property prices to go up. And in fact, prices in some of the second tier cities rather reasonable, considering, because as I was saying, wages is growing among laborers. And so when flats are selling for less than $500 a square meter, even some of the laborers, if both couple is working, can make the payments on these houses that are being sold. But the speculators know this, so now they're aggressively buying up flats in second and third tier cities, so that in 2 or 3 years' time, even a Wuhan or Xi'an, you won't be able to buy a flat for less than $500,000, which would be ridiculous. I mean, because these people, even though wages are going up, they're still not making more than $500-600 a month, right? And they're buying $500,000 flats. That's extremely high. When that happens, I think then the property market might be in trouble. And especially when the speculators think to themselves, like, this is ridiculous. Why don't I look for something else to invest in? Maybe even overseas. When that happens, that's called capital flight, which would lead to a catastrophic outcome in the Chinese economy. It would be. I would argue that, and tell me if I'm right, like, if what happened to Mexico happened to China, it would be much, much worse, because the entire system just runs on this huge amount of liquidity. But I don't know. It's just hard for me to imagine, because the scale was so different and it's so much larger. Everything is so much larger. And I don't know. So that's one thing that that I'm always trying to think about. Yeah.
Talking about capital flight, isn't there already a significant investment of China in the United States and increasing?
Yeah. Vancouver, actually. Yeah, everyone's been to Vancouver. Entire city blocks in Vancouver bought out by Chinese investors. For them, actually, Vancouver is a great investment, because for Canada, you only have to plow in $500,000 to get a Canadian green card. Once you get that, your kids go to school for free medical care. For them, it's like a great bargain. Yes, but foreign hot money going into China has been just tremendous. There's a huge amount of interest in Chinese real estate. I actually sometimes I go to these talks, panels with business people, and they're like, yeah, it's like free money. Indeed, it is like free money, right? So you're a real estate developer in the U.S., you go to China, you bribe a few people, get a piece of land, build something on top of it, you double your money in like a year's time. And construction is extremely fast in China, so you get the thing built in like a year and a half, double all your money right away. And it's free. It has been free money for these people. So people have been very excited about China. They pour all this money into real estate in China. And that has covered up the fact that actually, in fact, a lot of smart, rich Chinese people have been moving assets overseas.
Something related to what you're talking about, they've got this growing industrial economy, and they're very much dependent upon coal. And the United States is exporting more and more coal, West Virginia going out toward Asia. And now they're trying to do it from the Montana and Wyoming coal, the brown coal, and get it out through the state of Washington over to China. And China is now importing more and more coal.
Everything. Not just coal, but wheat, corn, soybeans.
I mean, could they reach a resource crisis at some point?
Well, yeah. So I mean, another problem that China will run into is, like, right now China runs trade surplus, as you know. But I think not just because of rising labor costs, but because of this increasing resource dependence, China is going to begin to run trade deficits very soon. So China used to be completely self-sufficient in. So I'll tell you this. I'll tell you a trade secret, since you guys are so nice to me, and I don't get to get out to Cleveland so much. The entire Chinese monetary policy is determined by pig prices. Just like, when do pigs fly? They fly in China. And the reason is because pigs is the favorite meat of China. And pigs, so Chinese pig production is the equivalent of, I don't know, like 60 or 70% of the world's production of pigs, right? And pigs eat soybeans and corn, right? So So it's all related. And if pig prices go up, then it also increases the price of other protein categories like chicken, fish, and when you add corn, soybean, pigs, and other proteins together, that actually makes up like 15% of the entire CPI weighting. So when pig prices go up, either because of soybean or corn prices going up, or because because pig prices was too low previously and people slaughtered the sow apparently. Anyway, there's this whole theory about sow slaughtering and effects on pig prices and stuff like that. Then actually inflation picks up, and the way the central bank reacts, like either raises or decreases reserve requirement, is actually loosely correlated with pig prices. And when you talk to central bankers, they say, "Oh yeah, we pay very close attention to pig prices. That's our first warning sign of when things will go well or go wrong." Where was I going? I have no idea. I just got solely involved in this like pig. Oh yeah, so independence. China used to be self-sufficient in soybean, which is a big feed for pigs. Now it actually imports 40% of it, and next year it's going to be more. The problem with soybeans is that I actually looked this up. It takes a lot of water actually to grow soybean. The entire northern China, which used to be a big soybean producer, is running out of water. Now it's actually a state secret as to how deep you need to dig to get to water. And the deep aquifer, and I think the Chinese government has estimates as to like how much water reserve is left underground in northern China. They wouldn't tell anybody, but what we do know is that it's decreasing, or it's lowering, the level is lowering very rapidly every year. So, I mean, sure, I'm not saying that water is going to run out in northern China next year. It might take another decade, it might take 2 decades, but the bottom line is that the cost of drawing out this water, it takes electricity to draw out this water, right? The deeper you go, you have to fight against gravity. The cost increases, and actually a lot of farmers can't afford it. That automatically will drive up, grain prices, and it's going to make more sense for some food producer to actually just import it from the U.S. or from Latin America. And so what you see is that year after year, Chinese import of corn and soybeans is actually going up, and that provides a floor to corn and soybean prices. And so when you look at some of these share prices of like Anderson or like, I don't know, like wheat, so there's a big drought in China. On top of that, there's a big drought in northern China this year, which will soon kill the entire winter wheat crop in China, so that the wheat market actually has been going crazy, at least in China. I don't know about in the international market. Yeah, no, but you're right. Yeah, a lot of dependence. Yeah.
Well, if there's no more questions, I just want to. Oh, you did have another question?
Oh yeah.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Real question was,
Yeah.
when's the short term over?
When's the short term over? Yeah. So there is kind of like an election next year in 2012. It's an 18-party Congress when the new president is going to come to power. And so before that, like any elections, even in a communist dictatorship, people are going to try to do the best to make sure that nothing goes wrong, right? So, but after the election, after late 2012, I think things may start to go wrong. Actually, that's when I'll start worrying. But before that, I mean, yeah, everyone will just keep the game going, and try to make everything pretty and this kind of stuff.
Will you make your slide presentation available?
Yeah, sure, yeah. I mean, you have, I sent it to you. Just send it to people, whatever. It's fine. All right.
There's really no more questions. Anyway, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.